Hey, Slater Crusaders, America is the greatest country in the world. Welcome to today's special about the book of Leviticus. Why are we doing this? Our culture today says that these are just silly stories of an ancient religion that doesn't mean anything anymore to us and all the rest. We are much more advanced than this old silly thing. We're much more progressive today, more enlightened than those backwards people in the Bible. My goal here is to show how relevant these ancient books are to us today. And while the world is looking for the latest, newest, shiniest fad to cling to find meaning, I prefer to go back to God. Jeremiah 6:16, stand by the roads and look and ask for the ancient paths, where the good way is, and walk in it and find rest for your souls. Look for the ancient paths, the ancient road. We'll get back to that more in the final segment. I want to start off with this point before we dive into Leviticus specifically. Our founding fathers read the Bible. They didn't just keep it on their desk and try to take it through osmosis. They read it and they knew it. There's always this debate about how Christian were they, whatever. That doesn't matter to me as much as they knew Scripture in and out. And you could tell because the way they just reference it in passing, and even these obscure scriptures, they knew their Bible cover to cover, and it changed who they were and then obviously what they created. When Abraham Lincoln, I know he's not a founding father, but we go with it. This is a man whose mother, Nancy Hanks, read him the Bible every day by the fire. She died when Abraham was 9 years old, but he later said of her, I remember her prayers, and they have always followed me. They have clung to me all my life. But Abraham Lincoln would make these allusions, right? So some of his famous lines, Lincoln said, a house divided against itself cannot stand, right? Everyone knows that line from Abraham Lincoln. The nation can't survive half slave, half free. That's Matthew 12:25. Jesus said, every city or house divided against itself cannot stand, right? So that biblical scriptural language was ingrained into Abraham Lincoln, not just at a young age, but throughout his life, right? Now, what's noteworthy is Lincoln did not say, hey, everyone, you know in Matthew 12:25, he just said it, and everyone knew it. Biblical knowledge was high amongst the American people. Lincoln also said that the Declaration of Independence was an apple of gold, and it was framed in silver. That the frame was the Constitution, right? That's Proverbs 25:11. A word fitly spoken by you now would be like apples of gold and pictures of silver. Lincoln did not say, hey, Proverbs 25:11. He just made the allusion, and everyone's like, oh, that's brilliant. I get it. Yeah, I see what you did there. If you go to Philadelphia, again, just another point about how the Bible is ingrained into our founding and who we are, what our culture used to be, at least. If you go to Philadelphia, you got to go see the Liberty Bell, right? It's fun. And don't get distracted by the crack. There's more than just the crack in it. Along the top, there's an inscription. This Liberty Bell was commissioned in 1751. It says, proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. That is Leviticus 25:10. The Bible shaped the habits and worldview and mindset of the founding generations. If you look at the private records and people's wills from the era, if they had a book to pass on down to family members, it was the Bible. That oftentimes was the one book. And it was certainly the one book that Americans were most familiar with. And today, we are not at all familiar with it. You ask people, seriously, you went on the streets and asked people, name a Bible verse. Name a book of the Bible. They probably wouldn't be able to. But if you said name a Bible verse, and the best thing you'll get is everything happens for the best. You're like, that's not in there. That's not a Bible. You just made that up. That's just like a quote from like an inspirational story. Like that's not in the Bible. Final point on this. There was a giant survey done of political literature in our founding eras. And the Bible was cited more than any European writer, more even than any European school of thought. So the Bible was quoted more than anything about the Enlightenment, The Bible was 1/3 of all citations. Deuteronomy, just Deuteronomy, was cited more than Montesquieu, twice as often as John Locke. Paul was mentioned in the founding writings more than Blackstone. Blackstone was the English judge who wrote commentaries on the laws of England. Paul was quoted more than Blackstone. Now, there are two main ways that the Bible influenced our founders specifically. First is in Deuteronomy 28 and Leviticus 26. Let's do Deuteronomy 28 first. If you faithfully obey the voice of the Lord your God, being careful to do all of his commandments that I command you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations of the earth, and all these blessings shall come upon you and overtake you if you obey the voice of the Lord your God. Blessed shall you be in the city, and blessed shall you be in the field or in the country. That is Deuteronomy 28. Leviticus 26, if you follow my decrees and are careful to obey my commands, I will send you rain in its season, and the ground will yield its crops and the trees their fruit. I will grant peace in the land, and you will lie down, and no one will make you afraid. I will remove wild beasts from the land, and the sword will not pass through your country. I will look on you with favor and make you fruitful and increase your numbers, and I will keep my covenant with you. But if you will not listen to me and carry out these commands, and if you reject my decrees and abhor my laws and fail to carry out my commands and so violate my covenant, then I will do this to you. I will bring on you sudden terror, wasting diseases and fever that will destroy your sight, sap your strength. You will plant seed in vain because your enemies will eat it. I will set my face against you so that you will be defeated by your enemies. Those who hate you will rule over you, and you will flee even when no one is pursuing you. And it goes on in Leviticus and gets worse. It gets worse for them, more brutal. That's Leviticus 26. Our founding fathers knew this, and they viewed America as a new nation founded on a covenant with God. That covenant. If we do this, then. If we don't, then this. This is why Ben Franklin's proposed seal, for like symbol for the United States of America, was this picture. This is Moses parting the Red Sea. Right? This is the scene from Exodus. The Israelites escaping Pharaoh and Egypt for freedom, just like our founders believed. We were escaping Europe for freedom. We are the second great Exodus. That's how our founding fathers viewed it, and they viewed America as a covenantal nation. Second great truth that our founding fathers learned from reading the Bible was the depravity of man. Original sin and man's depravity. This is at complete contrast with today's secular view that everyone is basically good deep down. We're all good people. Everyone's so nice and good and wonderful. If you just dig deep enough, everyone's good. No, wrong. This true biblical understanding of humanity and human nature is what led our founders to design a system of checks and balances, right? To prevent power from being held in the hands of fallen humans. Checks and balances, limited government, separation of powers, federalism, rule of law, due process of law, representative government, like all these systems that our founding fathers brought together and created were because they understood human nature. Today we don't understand human nature, which is why these fools think we should just have democracy or dictatorship and everything will be fine. I love this fact here. If you look at the oaths of office that were required in many state constitutions, and if you look at different statutes and different constitutions even in the founding era, over and over and over you see this term again. And it's easy to just like gloss over because it's like weird language, right? But it'll talk about future state of rewards and punishments. Like a funny way to, like, what is that? Future state of rewards and punishment. So here's just one example. This is the Constitution of the state of South Carolina. This is 1778. That all persons and religious societies who acknowledge that there is one God and a future state of rewards and punishments, and that God is publicly to be worshipped, shall be freely tolerated. And that's just one example. There's many, many oaths as well that have that in there. What does that mean? The future rewards of the future rewards and punishment, that's heaven and hell. That's what they're talking about there. They believed in heaven and hell. Most churches don't even talk about hell anymore. Most churches don't even talk about hell, let alone the world. That obviously is going to shape the worldview of our founding fathers. So I could go on, and we will a little more in the final segment. But let's take a break. Let's come back with our wonderful guests. I want to find out more about the book of Leviticus, the who, what, where, why, when, and then why is it so relevant to us still today? It is. Once you read it, at first you're like, wait, what is going on here? But once you get a little bit of understanding, then it all starts to fall in place, and it is a beautiful thing. I'm super grateful you're here. The book of Leviticus, coming up next. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, I'm so excited to dive into Leviticus finally now, and I can think of no better person to start us off than Rabbi Pinchas Taylor. He is the founder of the Ark, which is an online Hebrew Bible study and coaching program, and please definitely check that out. Rabbi, how are you, sir?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me again.
I'm grateful you're here. What's the website of the Ark? I want people to go there.
It's my name, PinchasTaylor.com, with the /Ark, A-R-K, like Noah's Ark.
Super. Okay, take us there. Give us the who, what, where, and when of Leviticus. The Israelites, they're just out of Egypt. They've been in Egypt. They've been surrounded by polytheism and ritual and cults and all this stuff. And now they're at Mount Sinai. What are they thinking and feeling and doing?
So interestingly enough, from the Exodus, when they left Egypt, there was a process of sort of purification, if you will, that went on until they received the Torah at Mount Sinai 50 days later. And so they had slowly been growing, slowly working on their emotional attributes, regaining aspects of their faith that they had been disconnected with. And that when they received the Torah at Sinai, that was the moment that they achieved the pinnacle of their belief, of their connection with God. Then we know how the story goes in the rest of Exodus. God, the people wind up worshiping a golden calf. God winds up forgiving them. Moses pleads for the forgiveness. And now we find ourselves in the desert. So Leviticus begins where we are commanded to start utilizing the Mishkan, the tabernacle, in the desert. And the function of the tabernacle was where really the nexus between spirituality and physicality would join together. Eventually, when the Israelites entered into the land of Israel, they would build the Holy Temple, which would be the permanent structure, the location that God and the Israelites would commune. And so this temporary structure was where the sacrifices were offered, where the connection to God was perhaps most strongest, where godliness was really felt in a palpable, physical way even.
Why did God want a tabernacle? Why did he do that as opposed to anything else?
Well, it's a great question. So one of the reasons that God creates a physical place where his glory is sort of revealed in the clearest sense is so we can have a semblance of connection. We can have a place where godliness is felt, is experienced in a way unlike anywhere else in the world. Truth be told, our belief is that when Mashiach comes during the times of the Messianic redemption, godliness will be apparent, openly revealed across the entire world. The tabernacle and later the temple were sort of a miniature representation of what the entire universe is going to look like at that time.
Interesting. Talk to me about the sacrifices, because this is something that can really turn a lot of people off quickly, right? Like we're killing all these animals. We're like, what's happening here?
So there were a lot of different types of sacrifices, by the way. A lot of people tend to think of sacrifices as being exclusive to sin. That's when a person did something wrong unintentionally, that they would bring a sacrifice. There were other sacrifices that were offered. I think the best idea or representation for the sacrifices is about what's going on the inside of us, okay? And what I mean by that is, again, the temple, or the tabernacle in this case, was a physical location that expressed spiritual ideas. So when I looked at the physical location of the tabernacle or of the temple, I would see spiritual paradigms playing out in front of my face in a physical way. And so when a person sins or a person wants to even just uplift themselves, make themselves better, the idea is that you are slaughtering the animal within yourself. You know, when we do something that we're not supposed to do, what's the reason that we do it? The animal part of my nature got the best of me momentarily. I erred, I made a mistake. And so the idea of slaughtering one's animal, the idea of a sacrifice, is the idea of internally slaughtering the animal within, slaughtering those animalistic drives, those tendencies that would lead you off the godly path. And so whether it was offering a Thanksgiving sacrifice, whether it was a sin sacrifice, this was a physical expression, a physical manifestation of what was going on the inside. I like to compare it maybe even to when you get flowers for your wife. A person does wrong to their wife, because it's always the husband that does wrong, by the way. When the husband makes the mistake and he has these heartfelt feelings of remorse, of apology, he might go to the store and get some flowers for his wife. If the flowers are a manifestation of the feeling of forgiveness and of love that he's trying to express, they'll be very, very nicely received. If he's just said, I did wrong thing, here, have some flowers, his wife's going to tell him exactly where he can stick those flowers. And so the idea of the sacrifices was a physical manifestation of a spiritual principle. And that's why we don't offer sacrifices, by the way, outside of the temple. Since the temple has been destroyed and we're not privy to experiencing a spiritual existence in a physical place, the offering of sacrifices has stopped, and we simply, if we want to connect with God in a special way, we maintain it only on the inside, only the personal feeling and bringing of ourselves to God.
Talk to me about Aaron and what's important about Aaron and what is established here.
Sure. I mean, Aaron is the high priest. He's the one who facilitates a lot of the rituals. He is the one who is, in many ways, the representative of the Jewish people, in particular in gaining forgiveness on the holiest day of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. He is sort of the holiest man in the holiest place on the holiest day of the year that is the representative on behalf of the Israelites to seek their forgiveness. And he overall is manager, the head of the tabernacle service. So he plays a very special role. Moses is the prophet who is engaged with God and essentially the leader of the entire nation. Aaron's role is specific to the tabernacle, and later on his role would be filled by the high priests in the temple. Got
it. What do we talk to me about God as holy? I think it's mentioned like 50 times or so in Leviticus. I am holy. What do we get from this?
Yeah, not only does God say he's holy, he actually instructs us to be holy because he's holy, right? So you shall be holy, for I, God, am holy. So the first question is, what does it mean to live a holy life? And so especially when you have many different commandments and rituals that are in the book of Leviticus that instruct us on what holy living, to eat certain foods and to offer sacrifices and purity and impurity, all would be in the description of holiness. So what is this commandment, you shall be holy, adding? And so the answer is, in the things that are mundane in your life, in the things that are not commanded and not prohibited, just the things that are mundane, they're allowed, that you should sanctify God even in that which is permitted to you. So things like eating, things like sleeping, things like working, those can all be a godly activity if done with the proper perspective. If eating a hamburger is only about satisfying my gluttonous desires, well, I maybe didn't do anything wrong per se, but I haven't acted in a holy fashion. And so the idea is that I'm also refueling be a better servant of God, to do my mission in the world. And it's interesting that even in English, the word holy is related to the word holy with a W, right? Meaning that you're entirely dedicated to God. Everything you do is for a divine purpose. In our tradition, yeah. Oh.
No, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, because I think that also ties into one last verse. We only got about 45 seconds. Leviticus 26:5, you will eat the bread to satiety. How do you pronounce that word?
Until you're satisfied. And so the blessing over there is that in response to observing the commandments, you'll eat bread and you'll be satisfied. Not necessarily will you have the quantity, but you'll be satisfied with what you have. That's a very important lesson for us in our lives. There's a much broader context. In our tradition, where there's a question that's asked in the Mishnah, who's considered a wealthy person? And the answer is the person who's satisfied with what they have. If you make $50 million and you're surrounded by billionaires and you're not satisfied with what you have, you don't feel like you're a very wealthy person. If you have gratitude for what you have and you recognize and you're happy with the lot that you had, it could be a lot less number in the bank, but you're happy. You are a very wealthy person. And so in our tradition, wealth is much more about mindset than it is about money. And being satisfied with the things that we have, that's the blessing that comes through the observance of the Torah's commandments.
Beautiful. And from thousands of years ago and perfectly relevant to today still, always. Rabbi Pinchas Taylor, founder of The Ark. Go to his website, pinchastaylor.com/ark, to take this online Hebrew Bible course. Wonderful. Rabbi, great to hear from you, sir. Thank you. Thanks
so much, Mike.
Coming up next, we got another guest. Full disclosure, my pastor. More about Leviticus. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, welcome back to our special about the book of Leviticus. So full disclosure, our next guest, I've been my family's been attending his church for the last few months now as we've been going through the book of Leviticus. And I bring that up also because my understanding is church attendance at Barabbas Road Church here in San Diego has about doubled as Pastor Matt Smith does hour-long sermons on Leviticus, which doesn't seem like seriously, Pastor Matt Smith is here with us. Pastor, how are you, sir? My wife and I, our first sermon we heard, it was like Leviticus 12 or whatever. And we're like, how is anyone here? Like, we love this. But we look around the room, we're like, it's amazing that other people love this too. So it's been amazing. So what do you think this says about our culture, that people are so hungry for study of Leviticus?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the big experiment, if you will, has just been to trust that when God says his word is relevant and powerful, that means the whole thing, right? So I was convicted just thinking through the idea that, after Jesus' resurrection, he brought them through the scriptures, and beginning with Moses, taught them the things concerning himself. And so I'm like, man, I just feel like we're missing sometimes the power of the word of God, like the whole thing. We've heard so much pablum for so long. And so we just started, we've gone through the whole New Testament. We've done Genesis and Exodus, and then just finished Leviticus. And we've seen folks show up, and I think there's a hunger to know, to kind of cut through all the, I don't want to say it was the propaganda and all the hype. People want to know what it really says. I just think they're a little afraid of it. And so the fact that we're willing to take this book that seems sort of daunting, people were excited. And I mean, when you'd stand up to read it, people would be like, what in the world is this going to be about? And then when they see it, they see God, they see the gospel in that. Man, it's eye-opening. I think they invited their friends, but it was always a weird thing to see. They'd bring somebody, they'd stand up, we'd read it, and people would be like, what in the world am I doing here? And then they'd hear it afterwards and be like, wow, the Bible's amazing. So it was pretty cool.
Amen. Let's bring about, where is the gospel in Leviticus? And where is Jesus in Leviticus?
So chapter 1 begins right away with this picture of an offering. And I didn't send that one over, but just Leviticus 1:1 to 1:7 is the first thing you see. And you start off understanding this came after Exodus. So they're on Mount Sinai, the Jewish people, and God is telling Moses, giving him the owner's manual on how to worship using the tabernacle and the priesthood, right? And so right away at the very beginning, you have this picture of like how to bring a sacrifice, which seems immediately irrelevant to us, right? But the first thing that jumps out is that when you would bring a sacrifice, a burnt offering, it tells us that it's the people are to bring. It says, when any of you, of the people of Israel, brings an offering to the Lord, you should bring it, and bring a livestock and so on. And then he says, if his offering is a burnt offering from the herd, he shall offer it. He shall bring it. He shall lay his hand on the head, and then he shall kill it. And then the priest's job isn't to actually kill the animal at that point. It's to like catch the blood, right? And so here you are, you commit a sin, and you go to this place, and you bring this animal that's supposed to be in your place. And you would lay your hand on the head of that animal, and then you yourself would then kill the animal. And while you confess your sin over that animal, right? And the priest's job is to catch it. And so immediately you get this picture from the beginning of the Bible, but Leviticus makes it vivid that this animal is representing you, and it's taking your place, and that sin is a really big thing. So, we always say that, God loves the sinner and hates the sin, but the thing that separates the sinner from their sin is the cross. And so you see this picture pointing forward to Jesus Christ. So it begins with this idea. And then all through you see this picture of sort of the high priesthood. And later, not to jump too far ahead, but just kind of sum it up in a minute, you get to Leviticus 16, for example, and you see verse 23. You see Aaron, the high priest, come in, and when he's done with his work, he's told to take the linen garments that he put on when he went into the holy place and leave them there. And so if you remember when when everyone found the empty tomb, they found those linen garments in the tomb. And Jesus is not there. He's done with his work. He's finished. The high priest has finished his work of and he sat down at the right hand of the Father, like the book of Hebrews says. So the whole thing's pointing forward to Jesus. But it also pictures that substitution and the work of Christ all the way throughout. It's very vivid and it's overwhelming. The New Testament's really a commentary on the Old, right? So it comes alive in that way. So it's amazing.
It's so good. And like that story right there, like it's amazing. I think you may have even talked about this last week. Like you have all these books of the Bible that are written over how many people, over how many years, and they're so perfectly in line and in tune with each other. Like that's absolutely stunning. Can you speak to that?
You have, if I'm honest, right? You take any guru or guy in a cave can write a book, and it can be all over the place. But you have the Bible written by 40 authors, 66 books by 40 authors over 1,500 years, on from paupers to princes, from oppressors to oppressed. I mean, you see people from every place of life talking about all sorts of subjects, and in all of it ends up leading to the same conclusion, to the same person with the same tone without contradiction. And so often people will say, hey, tell me about Jesus, but don't use the Bible. And I'm like, well, what do you mean? One of the 66 books from different people on different continents throughout history for 1,500 years that actually point to Jesus Christ. So the cohesiveness of Scripture is its own best evidence. We have an embarrassment of riches in its way it speaks, and it's consistent throughout, right? So that's the key that's so amazing. Like even though people are the authors, God's the superintending providential author of all of it. And so you can see his message all the way through. I mean, when you're in Genesis, you can tell that this is God's book in the same way you can when you're in Revelation. So it's and that when you go through it, you know what I mean? It's just, we get stuck on the genealogies and the details often because we just aren't sure what the narrative is. And we're used to using the Bible like a recipe book where we take verses here and there. But there's a narrative, and we got to understand it that way. And when we do, it becomes pretty awesome, right? So,
yeah. Talk to me about God says a lot in this, I think 50 times or so, I am holy. What do we learn about the holiness of God through Leviticus?
Yeah, I think it is great. So God basically lays out his worship. Like, here's how you're going to be holy because I'm holy, right? So first of all he repeats it over and over again. Be holy because I'm holy. And we think of holiness as just sort of a drag or something like God's a teetotaler or a rule giver. But holiness is the idea, it's a means to an end, right? So if God's like, if I'm holy, I want you to be holy because that's who I am. And this is how we're going to be, as Jesus' high priestly prayer, that we're going to be perfectly one. So holiness is this idea of being perfectly one with the Lord. And so it's a means to that. And so essentially it just means being other. It means being sort of alien and not like other things. And so we see that all throughout the Bible where, for example, Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, in Leviticus 10, offer strange fire before the Lord after he lays out this whole thing. And God consumes them right away, right from the start. And it's sort of scary. It's almost like they're surprised by God's holiness. And I think right away you realize I call that sort of the flames of presumption, because that's really, with holiness, God's not an idol. He tells us how to worship him. And so we don't get to pick, how we want to worship him. And so he tells us, and here's who he is. And we don't get to make him the way we want. We're supposed to be like him. And so that's all throughout Leviticus. And it's helpful because in light of all of this grace, this goodness, we don't want to take that for granted. He's actually real. He's not just a vending machine, just, we can make anything and, get whatever soda we want, right? So,
I got a big question. That leads into, because you're speaking of, all-consuming fire, and there's wrath and judgment. And I think people, because I've been a Christian for like 8 years or so. So I think still relatively recent enough where I can think back to my atheist days when I was very critical of all this stuff. So one of the arguments that I would have made, or what I would have thought of is, or even actually when I was a new Christian, is that's Old Testament God, right? That's like mean, wrathful, take out a whole city, mean God. And now we have like nice God. We have the New Testament God who's nice and loving and all that stuff. Same God. So how are we supposed to make sense of that?
Well, most people that say that, they intend well, but usually that comes from an idea in the New Testament, first of all, that's not actually, when you actually look at it, Jesus talks more about hell and judgment, the red letters, than anybody else really, right? So you see that Jesus talks about judgment, and you get to Revelation, for example, and it says everyone that's afraid during judgment, it says they hide in caves and say, save us from the wrath of the Lamb. Now, you know what I mean? Like, so that's the one side of the cross. But then you go to the Old Testament, you look in Leviticus, for example, and you remember Aaron, the high priest, in Exodus offered a golden calf. It's the most scandalous moment, right? Here they are, Moses up getting on Mount Sinai, and Aaron brings them in the worship of a golden calf. Well, here's the high priest that God instills, and it's Aaron, that same guy, and the first offering he's to make was for himself, and it's a calf. So in Leviticus 9, he's supposed to take a bull calf for his own sin before he starts to deal with the people's sin. If you're Aaron, first of all, you blew it really bad. Second of all, God's using you to lead the people. This is a picture of grace and redemption, and here he is offering a calf, being like, how do you not get overwhelmed by the fact that you don't deserve the grace? You see grace throughout the Old Testament and the New, and just like you see God's wrath and judgment, it's there throughout the whole time. You see a full picture of God in both Testaments all the way through. You just got to, but most of us just aren't willing to hear that and read it. And when you do, it's amazing.
We on that point, we kicked off with Deuteronomy 28 and Leviticus 26. We talked about covenant. What does that mean to God? Because I think it was in Leviticus 26 where it's like, if you do these things, I will do these good things. Or if you do these good things, I'll do these good things. If you do these bad things, then whole man, watch out. And he goes through this whole list of all these like terrible, awful things that he's going to do to you. How do we make sense of that in light of grace as well?
Yeah, so here's the thing. So it's conditional, right? So here's the blessings if you obey, and here's not. But check this out. It's the part that's so shocking about the covenant here is when he says, look, if you don't obey, I'm going to do this to you, and then I'm going to do this to you, and then I'm going to do this to you. And if you still don't repent, I'm going to do this to you. And so we tend to read it as like reward and punishment. But imagine somebody like a parent saying to a kid, hey, if you misbehave, I'm going to come. It's a picture of what God's going to do to chase after them. Like look at how much he cares, how much he's going to chase after them over and over and over again as their people. Remember, this covenant wasn't about them becoming the people of God. This was because they were. And so here's what he was going to do to follow through. And every single thing he said happened. They went into captivity, and there's no temple in Israel right now that they can worship God. They literally cannot follow. A Jewish person, as much as they might want to follow the Tanakh, cannot follow the prescriptions to sacrifice and worship. That they're not able to do that. And so these are the pictures of a nation that sort of rejects God. But there's one detail I think is helpful for people, is that when you hear about Israel, you're reading about sort of a nation, geopolitics, and the church is a little different. So it's not as easy to think about how it immediately applies to the individual. We have to build a little bit of a bridge. But in God's covenant, the picture that's so shocking isn't just the blessings and the curses, but the fact that he's promising to pursue. And I think that's so amazing.
Amazing. Last question for you, because I got my final segments coming up next, and I'm going to talk about leprosy. right? Which was Leviticus 13, and I'm going to steal a lot from your sermon there. But what do we need to know about leprosy in the Bible and how that relates as a picture of our sin today?
Yeah, leprosy was a picture of, it separated you from worship in every way, right? And so it made you, and people used to have to, the leper had to go into the community and cover his mouth and say, unclean, unclean, so people knew. And so in one sense, especially during the pandemic, everyone got a chance to feel like a leper a little bit, right? The way, like, where you felt unclean. I mean, truly, that's this crazy thing. So this picture is people separated from worship by their uncleanness. And we see that. And that was, it was just built, it was a sad affair, right? And then you get to the New Testament, and the shocking thing is the leper, who's supposed to be separated from everyone, comes up to Jesus. And Jesus, it says, reaches out and touches the leper. He heals him, but he touches him. And I think it's amazing because Jesus doesn't need to touch anybody to heal anybody, right? So him touching this leper is a huge deal. And it just really shows the grace of God to come into our dirtiness, into our uncleanness, and to get dirty with us, and to reach out to touch us. And he did this to show this man that he's loved. And so leprosy, you build up the case. And again, the New Testament's able to respond to the thing that we see in Leviticus. And if we don't understand Leviticus, we don't understand the impact of that scene in Mark, for example. And so it's amazing. So
we got about 30 seconds, Pastor. You said, because now you're going through Luke, and you said some statement, and this is not right, but correct me if I'm wrong, it was something like Luke looks kind of easy, but there's like a ton to it that you got to dive deep. And Leviticus, on the other hand, like looks super hard, but once you read it, like makes perfect sense and relevancy. Give a little inspiration, like you're fine. I should say it like this. Now that you've done like a year of studying Leviticus and going over it all, what's your big takeaway and encouragement for people to read it, dive into it?
Yeah, I think if you take your time in Leviticus and you structure the passage, you're gonna see the structure in 10 minutes. I mean, like in every passage you go through, it's very structured. It is not scary or hard. And once you see it, you'll be able to spot, what's the emphasis there. And once you can see the structure, it's the so what of the passage that leads you into the New Testament, and it becomes the color behind it. And so if Leviticus is seen in its light, all of a sudden the New Testament comes, it's the prequel, if you will, to everything you're going to see. And so I wouldn't be afraid of it. Now, when you get to Luke, for example, that's tricky because Christ hasn't died on the cross yet. He's still sort of talking to people under the Old Testament still. And there's a trickiness. It's not just, one-to-one. You have to do some work and nuance. Whereas Leviticus, you kind of get the problem right away, and you can see it. I mean, the structure is really plain. It's not playing a lot of subtlety, you know what I mean? So I think it's a great book for people not to be afraid of. And there's some, it's not a lot of commentaries, unfortunately, that I wish were really awesome, but that, you can always go to our sermons and check them out. They're online.
Barabbas Road. Pastor, thank you for leading our family through Leviticus. It's been awesome. And for being here. What's the website for Barabbas Road?
Barabbas.com. So BARABBAS.com.
Beautiful. Pastor Matt Smith. Thanks, brother. Appreciate you.
God bless. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, man. Coming up, we'll go into a little more detail on what the pastor was just speaking of about the lepers, Leviticus 13. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, welcome back to our special on Leviticus, and we will end our very shallow dive on Leviticus, but hopefully it inspires you to read it yourself. And I recommend Barabbas Road Church for a whole year's worth of sermons on every single chapter. Let's look at Leviticus 13. Again, seems so irrelevant. It's about leprosy. So leprosy is mentioned about 40 times in the Bible. Specifically, it is a skin disease. Often results in, and you see people with fingers and limbs missing. That's not from the leprosy itself. Like we used to think that leprosy like eats the skin or something like that. What it does is it attacks your nerves. So you have no nerve and no feeling in your fingers. So it's easy for your fingers to be cut off or burned off or infected or whatever. You don't even know it. So that's why there's missing limbs. But leprosy also in the Bible is referred to just general uncleanliness, right? So Leviticus 13 talks about spots on the skin, right? And we got to go quick here, so please go read the whole thing. But the point of it is, it can be anyone. And you could be thrown out of the camp and forced to be entirely alone, cast aside, forgotten, because you have some marks on your skin. Are you kidding me? I'm certain that right now you and I both have marks on our skin that a priest would banish you from the town because of. So what is that person to do? Leviticus 13:45 says, the leprous person who has the disease shall wear torn clothes, let the hair of his head hang loose, shall cover his upper lip, and cry out, unclean, unclean, like COVID. He shall remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean. He shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. So if you have any spot on your skin, that's what has to happen to you. Leviticus 14 is all about the process of getting clean again, right? You got to make a sacrifice, and then the priest puts oil on his hands and rubs it on your ear, and there's a whole thing, and there's a reason for all of that too, by the way. But the point is, leprosy is a physical reminder of your sin. You are an unclean person. This is incredibly important. This isn't like everyone's clean except for like that leprous guy. Whoa. No, everyone has a blemish on their skin. You are an unclean person. You with me? Now, the leprous person was supposed to be openly mourning while they were unclean. Why? What are they mourning? They're not mourning the disease, because again, it's not like they're dying from the disease. It's like a little like mark on their, right? So what are they mourning about? They're mourning because they've been cast outside of the camp. And as we talked about with the rabbi, the camp is where the tabernacle was. That's where back then you communed with God. So you were kicked out of it. You were outside of fellowship with God. The leprous person was separated from people and from God. And that's the worst thing possible. That's the worst thing conceivable. Psalm 84:4, it says, blessed are those who dwell in your house, God, the tabernacle. Verse 10, better is one day in your courts than 1,000 elsewhere. I'd rather be a doorkeeper in the house of God than dwell in the tents of the wicked. So this leprous person, you're isolated, ostracized, away from even the ability to praise God. You would mourn that. Now this is where Jesus comes in. Right? So the Pharisees ask Jesus, they say, why are you eating and drinking with tax collectors and sinners? What's going on? And Jesus said, well, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. He says, I've not come to call the righteous, but sinners. That's you. That's me. Without Jesus, you are unrighteous. You are the tax collector. You are the blind man. You are the lame man. You are the leper who's cast out of communion with God. You're out of the camp. You're out of the tabernacle. That's how Jesus saves. If you don't know Jesus, you're outside of the camp. And the absolute worst thing that could happen for you is that you're cast outside of the camp, you're away from the tabernacle, communion with God, and you enjoy it. Remember, Pastor Smith was telling the story of his prayer for the lost and unrepentant is that you are miserable in your lostness so that you will see your need. And that's the whole point of this leprosy thing, to show you how unclean you are. And he tells the story of a friend who was living with him because there were some fires in San Diego, so he had to get out of his house, so he was living with the pastor. And he wasn't a Christian at the time, this guy. He was a nice, moral guy, right? And Matt's like, hey, can I pray for you? And the guy's like, sure, whatever. Again, I wasn't a Christian, so he's like, yeah, I don't care. So Pastor Smith said, God, I pray you make Nick miserable until he accepts you. And they're done. And the guy's like, what are you doing? Why would you pray that? That's a horrible thing. And Matt's like, well, you don't believe in God, right? So what's the matter? Who cares? 2 weeks later, life went poorly. He came back to Matt, all dejected and like a leper. Our sin is a disease that covers our garments, it covers our house, we swim in it, it affects and defiles us. We are hopelessly unclean. But don't despair. As told in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, a man full of leprosy, full of it. Not a little freckle, full of leprosy, full of disgustingness, came to Jesus. And just the scandal of that alone, right? You're supposed to be cast aside, you're out, you have to stay much more even than 6 feet away. You have to stay far away. Right? This guy comes right next to Jesus, scandal. And the man said, Lord, if you will, you can make me clean. So the fact that he said Lord right up front says all you need to know about that man's heart. And then Jesus did. He said, I am willing, be clean. And as Pastor Matt Smith just told us a second ago, Jesus touched the leper, which he didn't have to do. But he did. You did it because you're not supposed to. You're not supposed to touch them. You're not allowed to be near them. They're not allowed to be near you. You're not allowed to be near them. You got to be way more than 6 feet away. But touched him. Maybe the first time this man's been touched in decades. But in this moment, the great physician, once you know Leviticus 13, is even more powerful. There's a lot of sin in the world, and your sin makes you as filthy as a leper. But you are not forsaken. Eternal life is available for you. And because I have one more minute here, let me go make one last point. Surely you've seen videos of people shoplifting with no shame. Surely you've seen all the examples of indoctrinating our kids into homosexuality and transgenderism and all the rest with no shame, openly celebrating it, flaunting it, all the rest. These people who do this are lepers in the sense that they have no nerve endings anymore. They're numb to what they're doing. Now again, don't judge, blah, blah, blah. I know I'm judging. I just did this whole thing about how we are all lepers, but so are they. And the difference is we know it. They don't. See the difference? So there's no question that, because I know we're thinking like, there's like all this chaos around us all the time. Like, why is everything like seeming like falling apart? Well, we're an unvirtuous people. Politically, socially, morally, spiritually. No question that would result in chaos. And it's a lot harder to put civilization back in order once you lose it, and we are losing it. So people are like, we need more policies or better politicians. No, right? We need to get connected again to our conscience. Your conscience is just like the physical pain that you feel when you touch a hot stove, right? You touch a hot stove, the physical pain says, don't touch that hot stove anymore, right? Your conscience is the same thing, but to moral danger. But when your conscience becomes so seared, so numb, so fried, that your conscience doesn't cry out to you anymore, that's when you as a person and we as a people are in trouble. Again, we used to think of the people who died from leprosy because we thought it was the leprosy that killed them, right? The disease ate away at their bodies. No, it's not that the disease eats away at you, it's that people stop feeling pain. So their body doesn't feel the pain anymore, and you do things that destroy your body, like touch a hot stove. You don't know it's hot, burns your hand off. So imagine that, but for our souls. The numbness and the leprosy of our souls. And dare I say that you and I are just as sinful as the shoplifter and whoever else. The shoplifter and that leper over there. Let's not think we're any better than them. But there's a way out. Mike Slater, spread the word.